two questions I see come up a lot are, one, how do I make a save system for my game? And two, how do I use time in my game? So in this tutorial, I want to cover both of those topics. And I'm going to do that by walking you through a project that I made for this tutorial. It's a mini farm game, because what better way to illustrate how to use time in your game than by creating a game that requires time in order to make the crops grow. And what better way to illustrate a save system than creating a game with so much to save, because we're saving the inventory, we're saving the crops we have planted in the fields, we're saving what stages of growth they're on, what time they were created. And later on, I will probably also, when we get to our save events, create these fields to be draggable, so you can even move them around, and we'll need to save that too. So this tutorial, I'm just going to divide it into two parts. In the first part, we'll go over laying the groundwork for the little game, along with the logic we'll need to keep track of time for the game. And then in the second part of the tutorial, we'll go ahead and create our save system. So let's get started. Let me close out of here. And I'm just going to create a folder on my desktop. And we're going to call this Tutorial Farm. I'm going to open that up, and I'm just going to copy my path. And now I'm going to drag my assets in there. And these are some simple assets I made in Inkscape. It's nothing special, but I'll include them on my itch.io page, and I'll leave a link in the description. That way, if you don't have your own assets to use to follow along, you can just go there and download these for free. Okay, so back in GDevelop, we're going to close out of this project. Let me hit Control W, because this is for beginners, so we are going to be creating this project from scratch. So we'll create a new project, and I'm going to call this project Tutorial Farm. And we're going to go ahead and paste my path in there. Okay, and we're going to leave the properties panel alone, except I do, of course, encourage you to always add your author name to projects that you're working on. So let's go ahead and hit apply. The next thing I'm going to want to do, I'm going to come into File and Preferences, and I'm going to want to scroll to the bottom and find the preference that says hide the menu bar in the preview window, and I'm going to uncheck that so that it's not hidden. And what that's going to do, when I run the preview, it gives me this bar up here where I can quickly toggle the debugger or even open the developer tools on the side panel. And it might be helpful because I might need to show you some things. So you can also do that if you would like to open your debugger more quickly or look at your developer tools. So now, the first thing we need, that any farm needs really, is a piece of land. So let's create a sprite, and we're going to name this sprite land, and we're going to add our land PNG. And the next thing we need is something to grow. Now here we can split off. For this project, I have decided to create the crops as the land object, just different animations of the land objects. And that's only one of the ways you can approach this. You can also, for instance, have the land as a separate object, and the crops would each be their own individual sprites, and you can just create the crops onto the land during your game logic. And that is a viable way to do it, and sometimes I actually prefer that method. But each method, doing it that way, creating different objects or creating it the same, each of those methods has strengths and weaknesses. There really isn't one better than the other, although one can be better than the other in certain situations. So a lot of that just depends on the type of game you're making and what you're going to be having it do. Now, the reason I'm going with part of them, with them being the same animation in this game, is because, as I mentioned, at some point I'm probably going to be adding draggable behavior to this land. And since we're already covering the topics of a save system and of a how to use time in the game, I didn't also want to cover the topic of how to link two different objects together, or how to create an ID system so that, say, when you're dragging a piece of land, the crops that are a separate object on top of it will follow along. So this is just an easier way for having the crops follow along, is just to have them as the same object. But that's why we're doing it this way in this tutorial. It's really, like I said, there's no way better than the other. There's strengths and weaknesses to both approaches. So it really just depends on the preference of the developer. And sometimes it depends on the assets you have too. Especially if you're using pre-made assets, you might be stuck to doing it one way or another. So as you can see, I've added all the sprites to my land object, and I've added them in order of growth: seedling, mature plant, wilted plant, seedling, mature plant, wilted plant. And we're going to be adding using these animation numbers later, so that's why I put them in that specific order. So let's drag our land out onto our scene, and if you can see, this land is 100 by 100, but the visible part is 100 by 50. So we're going to set up a grid. First I'll show the grid, and then I'm going to set it up, and I'm going to put the width as 100, the height by 50, and we're going to check isometric so that it'll snap it correctly. And in GDevelop, you can hold control down and then click your object and hold your mouse down while you drag it, and it will duplicate that object across the screen. And it's a super fast way to make more than one object. However, it can be tricky if you're trying to position things in an exact way. So I am going to pause this video right now so that I can mess around with this and get it set up the way I want. Okay, now that I've got that set up, and I did have to manually drag them into place, so don't feel bad if you had to do that too. So now I'm going to change the background to make it more farm-like. We could come into our scene properties, and we can change the color that way, but I prefer to change the color by coming into the color right here, because that will update the color in real time, so that you can quickly see if you're happy with the color. Okay, so once we get it set the color we want, the next step we're going to need is we're also going to need a way to interact with our land and tell it what we want to do. So as you saw, we had a little some little icons on the side of the scene. We'll go ahead and add those now. I'll add a sprite. I'm going to call it berry icon, and we'll just add our animation. We'll add the berry icon animation, and for our behavior, we want to give it the draggable behavior so that we can drag it over our sprites. So let's hit apply to that. Let's duplicate this item because it already has the behavior we want on it. We'll call this one wheat icon. We'll swap the image out to our wheat icon, and we'll go ahead and hit apply, and we'll duplicate this one more time because we have another draggable object, and we're calling this object blade. And we will go get our blade animation. We'll get rid of our wheat animation and hit apply. So all of these are set up, and as you can see, they all have the draggable behavior. So let's drag these out onto the scene and just position them anywhere you want to. We're not going to look at making a menu in this tutorial because, like I said, we're already covering saving features and using time. So that should be enough information in one tutorial. So let's go ahead and set those at 50. And when we run the preview, the first thing we're going to notice is we can sure drag these items around. But for our purposes, we also want them to snap back in place whenever we let them go. So let's go ahead and work on some logic in that. Now, if you're new to GDevelop, even if you're brand new, you probably know the one way to store information is to use variables. So we can give this object two variables. We can call one variable x position, and we can store the x position of the object. And then we can name one y position. And we can look, say, oh, it's at 50 by 150. So I'll put 50 in the x and 150 in the y. And we can do that to each of our items. Okay? And that's perfectly viable if this is, but sometimes it's better to think ahead. Like think, what if I don't always want my items here? What if this is just a quick little sample game and I'm probably going to move them somewhere later? Or what if I want to add 50 more? Will I really want to have to go in and every time I move the item or add another one and put it into the scene, I'm going to have to create two more variables and look at where they are and change that. So what we're going to do it the easy way. We're going to have the game. We're going to have the game create those variables and then add the information we need into those variables. So that'll be one of the first events we get going. We'll hit a Shift A. That's going to pull up a new event. Go ahead and highlight that and then hit Shift W so we can get our event group menu. And we'll call this setup. So this is going to be our beginning of scene events. And I like to indent this. So I don't want you seeing me indenting it and thinking that's something you have to do. You do not have to do that. I just prefer that. So it's not necessary to make the GDevelop run correctly. So now in our condition, we're going to hit beginning of scene. Okay. And we're going to add a new event. Let me hit Shift A and get a new event. Now this one, I want to be part of the beginning of scene. So this one, I really do have to indent under the beginning of scene. Because if I don't, it's now a separate event and it has nothing to do with these beginning of scene events. So I have to just bring it under. And for this event, I'm going to create a variable. And I want to create a variable for each of these objects. And I want that variable to be called X, and then I want another one to be called Y. And that way I can tell GDevelop to store their X and Y position in those variables. But I don't want to do that for each one. I want to do that for a whole group of them. Because that way, no matter how many I add to that group, I never have to come in here and say, oh, well, now I'm adding corn to the game, so now I got to change corn as a variable too. So let's go make a group that we can put all of our little menu icons in. And of course, I'm just going to call this group menu icons. Okay, and we'll go ahead and edit this group, and we're going to add our three menu icons: the berry, the wheat, and the blade. Okay, and now that we have our group, let's go create the variable for the group. We'll select menu icons, and then we'll put variable. And we're looking for this value of an object variable because that's a number variable. And we're about to assign a number into this variable. So we're going to call this one X, short for the X position. We're going to set it to the number of our menu items X position, which we don't know what that is. So we'll just tell GDevelop to go find that for us. Menu items X. Okay. Go ahead and set that one. And now we're going to go ahead and copy this. And we'll just paste it right in there. And this variable, we're going to change the name to Y. And on this variable, we want to store the information of the Y position of the menu icons. So we'll tell GDevelop to look for the Y position and to store it in this variable. So I hope you can see we're creating this variable and giving it information at the same time. So now if we preview our scene and we go ahead and let's open the debugger. And we're going to look at our menu icons. We'll look at the berry icon. And sure enough, now we see that it has two variables. An X variable with its X position and a Y variable with its Y position. So we've created those variables and given them a value without ever having to come in here. And a lot of times the only time I even add variables in here or in your scene variables is if it's a variable, I need to have a certain default when the game runs. Then I will do that. But I'll show you more on that later because we will have to create some. So now let's go ahead and hit Shift A and then Shift W. We'll add our next event group. And this one we're gonna tell GDevelop what to do with this information we just got. So let's go ahead and add a condition. And what we want to do is when we drop the item or when we let go of it, it will change its position and go back to where it was, which we've stored in those variables. So let's hit menu menu icons, and since it has the draggable behavior, we can use being dragged or was just dropped as conditions. So let's just say our menu icons was just dropped. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And then we want to We want to change the position. So we'll hit menu icons position. If we wanted to change the X position or the Y position, we can use those. Since we're changing both, we'll go ahead and hit that. And we'll set it to, and now we don't know the value to set it to. That's the one we told GDevelop to get. So now we got to pull up that value that it stored. So we'll go ahead and hit menu icons and a variable. And the name of that variable was X. So we're going to set the X position to the menu icons X, and we're going to set the Y position to the menu icons variable Y. Okay, so now when we run the game, if we test it out, we will see that it does indeed snap them back when we let go. So far so good. Now, the next thing will not apply to you unless you are making your project for touchscreen devices, which I don't know why you would be since it's just an example project, but I do make my projects for touchscreen devices. So one of the things I like to consider is what can touchscreens do that mice can't do, and they can do things like this. And I don't necessarily want to have to write logic that deals with how to behave, how my game should behave when all the menu items are flying around at once. So I'm going to just add some logic to prohibit that behavior. So since we know what we want to do, we want to say if we're dragging these items around and more than one of them are being dragged around, we want to deactivate their draggable behavior so that they can't both be dragged around. So that's super easy. Let's go to menu icons and then we'll say is being dragged. We'll go ahead and hit OK. And we'll go ahead and say sub-event to this, if the number of menu items being dragged is more than one. So menu icons instances, the number of instances currently picked. So of the number that we're dragging currently, is that number greater than 1? Okay, so if so, what we want to do is we want to get menu items behavior, the draggable behavior, we want to make sure it's not activated. Okay, so now if we test this out, let's see. If I grab the blade and then I grab the wheat, the blade goes snapping back. The problem is, of course, when you tell a computer to stop something, then you also have to tell it when to start it back up. So now we can't drag these at all. We can drag the strawberry because we didn't deactivate its behavior. We only deactivated the behavior of the two items we were dragging. And now they're back in their same position and we need to tell it to activate the behavior. So the most logical place to do that, let's copy this condition right here, is under the dropped condition. Because if we're dragging both of them and it deactivates them, that means it dropped them. And so now we can reactivate that behavior. So let's go ahead and put activate behavior of draggable behavior of menu items, yes. So now when we hit two items at once, it will deactivate the behavior, but it'll reactivate it as soon as it goes back to its position. So now that we have that taken care of, the next thing we need to look at is probably planting crops. Because now we can drag our items around. We need to tell it how to interact with the dirt. So we can already guess we're probably going to tell it, hey, if you're touching this dirt, plant a strawberry seed. So let's handle the touching the dirt first, okay? So one thing we got to think about, if we're using a collision-based detection like that, like, oh, you're touching the dirt, let's go look at our collision mask. Because I guarantee you, when a player is dragging a strawberry up here, that doesn't mean they want to plant this field down here. It probably just means they're dragging the strawberry by that field on the way to other fields that they do want to plant, okay? So when they want to plant the field, they're going to, come down here and touch the dirt. So we need to get rid of this, because that might startle and annoy players if they're just harmlessly, innocently dragging their strawberry by on the way to somewhere else, and all of a sudden this field is planted. And they're like, I was saving that field for my wheat. So let's go ahead and we'll use a custom collision mask. And we'll just move this down wherever we feel like it would be a good place for the player to have a collision that would plant their seeds for them. So let me go ahead and even these numbers up. We're going to hit 50, 50, 50, 75, 75. So now another thing you can look at, share the same collision mask for all sprites of this animation. We could turn that off because this animation has different sizes. For instance, if you go to 5, we have the same collision mask right here, but the object is much taller. So we say, well, what if they're trying to harvest it? They might want to be up here. So we could just change this collision mask and make it bigger on certain animations by turning that off. I'm not going to for this example because I've already made the project once earlier when I was making it for this tutorial, and it works fine with just the dirt. And plus, just for a tutorial project, there's really no sense in going through all that work. So I'm just going to leave it as it is with that same collision mask for each animation. So now the second thing we need to look at dealing with collisions, okay, what about our wheat and our strawberry? I mean, they're kind of big, and look, they're hitting 2 or 3 fields at one time, okay? So what we could do is also come in here and edit the collision masks on these two. So say we use a custom collision mask and we're like, well, it only makes sense if the bottom part of this wheat is what touches the ground to plant the crops. And that way the player won't have to worry about accidentally touching 2 or 3 fields with the rest of that collision mask. Okay, but the problem is these are objects that have a draggable behavior. And so what happens when you have objects with a draggable behavior is that collision mask matters. Okay, that collision mask matters. Let me see if it matters for my finger. Yes, even my finger can't get it to move. And my mouse can't get it to move unless I'm on the part where we left the collision mask right here. And that might just needlessly annoy the player when they're trying to grab an object and they're like, come on, why aren't you working? They don't want to have to try to grab it in the specific corner. So instead of using that kind of collision-based detection, what we're going to do is we're going to use a point inside detection. So we'll get rid of this custom collision mask right there. And instead we're going to add some points. We're going to add a point that we want to be inside the land before the land will be considered planted. And that way the whole thing, we can keep the collision mask for the draggable behavior, and yet the collision mask won't act on the land to create a planting. So just put this point wherever you think makes sense. I'm going to put mine down here. So only if this part of my wheat is in the land will the land plant anything. And let me just make these numbers a little nicer looking. All right, and I'm going to call this point, I'm going to call it so. And we're going to go ahead and close and apply that. And I'm going to need to add a point in the berry icon too. And for this point, I'm going to need to call it the same exact thing so that I can just use one set of events to reference it. Because if I named this one strawberry so and that one wheat so, then I would have to say if the menu icon was in point strawberry so was in the land, do this. If point wheat so was in the land, do that. So we're going to make the same name and just put this one where you think it makes sense. I'm going to say if this is in the land, then the player can plant something. And I'm going to fix my numbers over here. Okay. Oh. Okay. And now I'm going to go ahead and close and apply that. So now the third thing we're going to think about is when we're calling behavior that we want to happen when the strawberry or the wheat is being dragged. We don't necessarily want it to happen when the blade is being dragged too. So even though we already have a group that includes the strawberry and wheat that we call menu icons, that's just a group we use to put them back where they belong. So we're going to make a new group, and we're going to call this one crop icons. And this will be a group that we reference when we want to talk about how it's interacting with the dirt to plant items. So in that group, we're going to go ahead and just put our berry icon and our wheat icon. And we'll go ahead and apply that. Okay, so now that we have that done, we can deal with creating some logic that causes our menu icons, or rather our crop icons, to interact with the land and grow some crops. So let's add a new event and a new event group. And let me just call this event group, I'm going to call it planting crops. Yep, we select it. And I'm going to call this one menu icons placement. Okay, so let's think about this. The first thing we want to do when planting crops, we want to tell it if our strawberry is touching the dirt to plant a strawberry seed. So let's go ahead and hit crop icons, because that includes our berry icon and our wheat icon. And the collision we were going to use for this was called point inside. Oh, actually, since we are doing point inside, we're going to need to grab our land, because that's the object that the point is inside of. So let's grab our land, and then we'll search for point. And this is the one we want, point inside object. And the point we want to check is the crop icons, the little points we gave the berry and the wheat. So let's go ahead and hit crop icons, and then we'll put point. And it says point X object name. Okay, so our point X, our object, our point name was so. So let's go ahead, we're going to do this in double quotes, so. Okay, same thing with the point Y. Crop icons, point, we're going to want this point Y, and still the same name, so. So we're going to now check if crop icons, point X, and point Y is inside, crop icons, land. Okay, so if it's inside the land, then we're going to want to do something. And for now, let's just say we'll change the animation of land, and we'll change it to number 1, which should be the strawberry seedling. So right away, we might have a problem, and that's why we're just using this simple change the animation, because we're just going to test something. And what we're going to test is, how will it know which crop icon we're talking about? Because we have 2 of them. So how will it know which point inside the land? So let's go run our test, and we'll see, okay, so when I say that, it's thinking it can just pick which crop icon it wants, and the one it wants is the corn. It doesn't want the strawberry. So we have to now tell it which one to pick, and an easy way to do that in this instance is the one we're dragging. That's the one we want it to pick. So if you recall, we had up here a menu icons is being dragged. So now let's do the same thing for our crop icons. We're going to put crop icons is being dragged. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and bring this down and make it a sub event to that. So now let's run our test again. And we're going to see everything's working fine now. Now it knows whichever one we're dragging is the one we want. I think my strawberry point is messed up though. Let me go see what I've done with that. With that strawberry point, because he is not wanting to plant anything. Maybe move it up there. Oh, we'll see what I did. I didn't change the name. So no wonder why it can't tell, because I didn't change it to so. So let's go ahead and push 72. Just going to even these numbers out a little. And let's run that and see if it works just a little better. Okay. So now that we know our logic works, we can set about actually changing it to the animation we want. So for the strawberry, we do want it to change to 1. But for the wheat, we want it to change to animation 4, this little wheat seedling. So what's a good way to tell it that? Well, a good way is to come into our variable, and now this is where we start making our own variables, because this is information we're going to need at a certain default when the game runs. So let's add a variable, and I'm going to call this variable stats, because it's going to be the stats of everything about this strawberry object. We're going to change this variable to a structure, and we're going to give it a child. And the first child we give it, we're going to change that to a structure too. And I'm going to call this child stage. And this child is going to be a stage for each animation. So let's give this variable 3 children of its own. So here's the parent of stage, and here's the children of stage. So we're going to make up 3 different names to represent each animation state. So the first name we'll call it seedling, and that'll be the small animation of the crop. And so the next one we'll call it harvest, and that will be the ripe animation of the crop. And the third animation we'll call it wilted, and that'll be the dead animation of the crop. And we're going to change all these to number. Okay. So what other information will we need to tell the land besides what animations it should be having? We also need to tell the land how long to grow each crop. So let's add another child to stats. And this child, we're going to call it growth length. And that's how long we grow the item. We're going to set that also to a number. We're going to leave it at 0 for now, because we'll get to time probably in the next event after we set up the animation event or the planting event. So let's just set up the planting event first. Now before I fill this information out, we're just going to leave it blank for now so that I can copy it. And now that I have it copied, let's go ahead and fill it out. So growth length we're leaving blank until our next event. So for now we'll set our harvest animation of the strawberry. That was animation 2. And our wilted was animation 3. And our seedling was animation 1. So let's hit apply and save those changes. And now we're going to go into our wheat icon, and we're going to go to variables, and we're going to paste that variable structure we had in here. And it's going to bring back the same variable with the same names. So again, we'll leave the growth length blank for now, and we'll just concentrate on these 3. And for the seedling animation of the wheat, I believe that was 4, and the harvest animation was 5, and the wilted animation was 6. So now we have the animation set up. We can specify which animation we want the land to change to. So we're going to have to figure out some way to take the information in our crop icon and pass that information to our land so that our land knows what to do next. We have values stored in our land that we can tell GDevelop what to do with those values, okay? So one way we can pass this into our land is we can do it one by one. So for instance, the way we would reference an animation, we can say land variable, value of an object variable, and we can create this variable and we can call it the same thing that we called in our icon variable. We can call it stats and we can give it a child named stage. So stats dot stage, okay? And then we can set that to, oh, and also we need the child of that child too, because we're trying to get the number of that. So we could call this stats stage and then dot seedling, because seedling stores the variable number we need. And we can set that variable to our crop icons variable stats stage seedling. So now what it's going to do is it's going to create a variable in our land called stats stage seedling. And it's going to go into our crop icons variable stats stage seedling. And it's going to get that number and it's going to store it in our new variable that we just created in our land. Okay? That's one way we could do it. And then we can use that, let me undo that. Then we can use this information to change the number of our animation of land. We can then set it to our land variable, land variable stats stage seedling. So what would happen then is this has a number in its stat stage seedling variable, and it's passing that number into our land stat stage seedling variable so that it knows what seedling to plant. Okay? So that is one way we could do it, and we could do that step by step for every variable that we stored in this. Even if it gets to be 10 pages long of information, we can just step by step call each one and store it into land. Or we could just do this the easy way. So let me go ahead and delete this. And what we're going to do instead of changing the variable, we're going to go into land and we're going to create a variable. And this variable we want is to be the text of an object variable. So let's create a variable called stats. Okay? And it's a text variable. It's going to store a long string. And the string we want to store is the whole variable structure that's in our crop icon. We want to move that over to our land. So let's, to do that, we're going to have to look for a JSON. And we're going to have to look for object var to JSON. And then we'll need the name of the object, a comma, and the name of the object variable that we want to turn into a JSON. So let's hit object var to JSON, and the name of the object we want is our crop icons. And then we use a comma, and the name of the variable that we want to turn into a JSON is stats, our whole stat structure. We want to turn that into a JSON, and we want to store it into our land. And we want to do that every time we're running this this crop icon over our land, okay? So, go ahead and add a new event. Just drag this down here and toggle it out for a minute. So let's go ahead and run this, and we'll just run our wheat over all the land. Okay. And we'll open our debugger and we'll check out our land variables and we'll see what they look like. So as you can see, we now have created a variable called stats in our land that has this long string that is the JSON object that we took out of our crop icon and stored into our land. So now what we want to do, we want to turn this into a structure that looks just like this so we can use it, because you really can't use it as it is the other way. Like if we want to add more things into here or change certain values of this, we need it to be in this structure. So the way to do that, let's go back to our events. We now need to convert this string that we just made in stats into a structure. So let's, in our action, let's type JSON, and we're going to see convert JSON to an object variable. So let's select that. Now our JSON string is stored in land variable. Oops, not that variable. Anytime it says toString, you're dealing with the number. And of course we know that that was a text we just stored. So land variable, and we're looking for this one, variable string, and the name of the string was stats. That's where we stored that string. And now we're going to choose the object to parse this or structure this into. Of course, it's our land. So we're getting it out of land, we're putting it right back into land, and now the variable name where we want to store it, and that's stats. So we stored it into stats to begin with. Now we're taking it out of stats, we're converting it, and we're putting it right back into stats. But now it's going to be a structure. So let's go ahead and run our new preview. And we'll just go ahead and pass the strawberry over some land, and we'll check out our debugger. And if we look now, we can see instead of that long string, we have a nice variable called stats with all our information set up just the way we wrote it in our menu icon. And this is in our land though. So that's working good. So the next thing we're going to want to do is now that we have that variable set up and this variable set up, we're going to need to say how much time needs to pass for our growth cycle to be considered done. So if you can see in our crop icon, we don't have a stats time. We have a stats growth length, and that's going to be what we set the length of time we want it to grow. So if we want it to grow for 10 hours, we would set that here. And that way we can have a way it'll pass to our land, and our land will know that it needs to grow for 10 hours. So we are going to create a variable called stats time in our land. And that's going to be a child of the stats that we imported over. Excuse me, let's look for variable. That we imported over from our crop icon. So the value of an object variable, because this is going to be a number, and we're going to call this stats.time. So we're making a new child in that variable, and we're going to set that to, okay, first of all, how are we going to deal with real world time? So we'll cover that part, and then we'll show how to add our time that we want it to grow to that real world time. So to do real world time is super easy. And I'm only showing you one way to do it. I'm showing you the way I prefer to do it. So I prefer to use real world time by calling up time, and I want this one that says string right here. Okay? And now if you put double quotes, you're going to get a list of choices you can use. You can use hour, month, day, minute. Okay, the one I'm going to use is timestamp. I really like working with timestamp. What timestamp is, it returns to you the current day, the current month, the current year. It returns the current time, everything in milliseconds. So it's one long millisecond number. So let's just see, let's just run our preview real quick so you can see what timestamp looks like. So let's go ahead and activate our field so it'll switch the little variable over. And let's check one of our lands. And now you see on that structure that we switched over, we've created this new child of it called time. Okay? And then this is the millisecond time that was returned, or timestamp time. And this is super easy to work with. That's why I love using it. For one reason, it's super easy. Milliseconds are very similar to seconds. You just add 3 zeros. So if something is 10 seconds, you would add 10, you would write 1 0 and then 3 more zeros, 0 0 0. So it's easy to convert milliseconds to seconds, and it's easy to convert seconds to milliseconds. So the second reason I love dealing with milliseconds has to do with how seconds work. Because humans are intuitively aware of time as seconds. So, for instance, if I was to ask you, how many seconds is in a minute? You would instantly know there's 60 seconds in a minute. So then if I said, well, how many seconds is in 10 minutes? You would obviously know there's 600 seconds in 10 minutes. Okay? So if I was to ask you, how many seconds was in an hour? You know, you could easily say, well, if there's 1,800 seconds in half an hour, then there must be 3,600 seconds in an hour. And so since we're so used to time as it relates to seconds, it's really easy to convert that into milliseconds. And since we have this timestamp that already runs in milliseconds, it's just easy to use that in your game as the value of time. So I really prefer using timestamp. So we're already changing the time to timestamp when we run our little things over the field. Okay. Let's go ahead and move this back up too, so our little animations will start changing again. So every time I'm planting something now, it is actually setting the field to the current time. So how do I get it to set it to the time I want it to grow to? Well, the answer is super simple. So since we're working with milliseconds, we would come to our menu icons, and we're going to go to our growth length. That's how long we want the object to grow. And so for strawberries, I'm going to want it to grow 15 seconds. So I would add 3 zeros to that to make the number of milliseconds I need it to grow. And for the wheat, on my growth time, I want it to grow for 10 seconds. So I'm going to add a 10 with 3 seconds to get my millisecond. So now, when I'm telling the game that I want it to grow for 10 seconds, what I'm going to need to do is change my variable stats time. I'm going to have to set it to the current time now, which is timestamp, plus the value that I set in that variable stats growth time. So let's go do that. We will set stats time to, let's delete this real quick so you can see it better, land variable, and remember that was stats dot growth length. So I'm setting it to the variable in there, which was 10 seconds or 15 seconds, and then I'm going to add that to our time, double quotes, and then pick out timestamp. Okay, so now when I plant it, it is going to change our variable time to the current time plus the amount of time we want our object to grow. Okay? So that is the time we're going to compare against the real world clock to see if our object is grown. So how we're going to do that, let's add a new event group. And we're going to call this event group Growing Crops. So what do I want to do really? I want to see if this number I set, which is the time now, say it's 3 o'clock now, plus the time I want it to grow. So I want to see the time now, 3 o'clock, plus 10 seconds from now, or whatever. So I want to compare the real world time and see, is this value that I set here, is it less than the time now? Because say it was 3 o'clock, so it set it for 3 o'clock plus 1 hour. Then I want the game to look at the clock and say, is 4 o'clock less than the time it is now? Because if 4 o'clock is less than the time it is now, that means it's finished growing. If it's 5 o'clock and 5 o'clock is greater than 4 o'clock and it should have been done at 4 o'clock, then it's finished growing. It just stands to reason. So that is how easy it is to deal with time. All you really have to do is set your time to the current time the player does the action, plus the time you want the action, how long you want it to last, and then set up an event to compare that time to what time is it now. And if this variable is greater than the time it is now, say this variable is, let's see, say it's 1 o'clock, you want it to grow for an hour, so it's 2 o'clock when it's done. And right now it's only 1:30. The game can see, well, 1:30 is not greater than 2 o'clock. And 2 o'clock is not less than 1:30. So it's not done growing. So that is just how extremely simple it is to deal with time. So let's go ahead and we will write our event. And for this event, we'll just say, we'll say if the variable stats time of land, so land variable, value of an object variable, stats dot time is less than the real world time of timestamp, time string, double quote, timestamp, then we're going to need to change, let me toggle that disabled, then we're going to need to change the animation because that means it's done growing. Okay, so let's add a new event and we'll say change the animation to harvest because it'll be the harvest stage. So land animation, change the animation, and we'll set it to the value we have stored in our land, which was land variable stats dot stage dot harvest, because that's where we stored the number of the harvest icon. So let's go ahead and test out our logic. And we'll go ahead and plant our seeds. And then we'll wait 10 or 15 seconds, which ones I gave it to. Then we'll fix that, why it's doing that. And we see it does work. After 10 seconds, it changed the animation. It saw that 10 seconds was less than the time it is now, and it changed it. Okay, so two things I noticed. One, we're going to fix that real quick where we can plant over things. I've been noticing that, but I was talking about other stuff, and it's not that important. So, see how we can keep planting over stuff? That's because we didn't set up any condition here to check if it's already got something over it. So let's set up that condition now. I'll just add a new event, and we'll make these two a sub-event of that. And for this condition, we'll check if the land current animation is equal to 0. So now it will only let us grow things or plant things on that land if the land's animation is 0. And if it's not 0, it's not going to let us do that. So that's the first thing we're going to fix. Okay? And now you see I can't plant over the strawberries. So the first problem's fixed. The second problem I noticed has to do with our our Y order, see how because of the style of art I'm using, things can appear to be incorrectly behind stuff. So let's go ahead and really quick, we're going to import an extension. And this extension is named YSort. And we'll just install that in our project. And we'll go back to our land. And we're going to give it the behavior of YSort. So that will solve that problem there. And so another problem we're going to notice now that we have YSort on is that we're going to need these on a different layer. So I have a new layer down here, and we're going to call this layer UI. And we're going to select all our objects, and we're just going to move them to that upper layer, that UI layer. So that now when we drag them around, they're not going to be Y-sorted behind the items. Okay, so back to our logic. So the next thing we want to do is we want to say, okay, we set the time it should grow to the time now plus the time, the length of how long we want it to grow. Plus that number of milliseconds. Time now plus the number of milliseconds we want it to grow. And then we checked and saw, oh hey, it's done growing because it's less than the current time. So now what we want to do is we want to say, oh, it's on the harvest animation. So let's go ahead and change the time again so that we know how long before it wilts. So let's copy this one right here, change the variable stats time, and let's paste it down here. And you might think we could get away with doing a similar logic. We could say change the variable stats time of land and set it to, say we want it to wilt in 10 seconds after it was done growing. So we could put 10,000 milliseconds plus time timestamp. And logically you think, well, we could do that way. But that's not going to work how I want it in this example. Because what that's going to do is, say the player plants a strawberry and leaves the game, closes the game up. And later they open the game, 2 days later. And what the game logic is going to do is it's going to come down here and it's going to say, is my saved time that it should have been done, is it less than the time now? Oh, yes, it is. Okay, then now we'll add our timestamp to the current time now, which is 2 days later, and then say it'll wilt 10 seconds from now. And that's not what I want. I want it to not wilt 10 seconds from now, whenever they check the game. I want it to wilt 10 seconds after it was grown, So this would only work if their game never stopped, if they always had it running, if it never was sent to the background and put into a pause state by the system, if they never closed the game, then this would work. But since that's not true, the game will be paused sometimes if they send it to the background, or they will close the game to go do other things. Then we can't add it to the time now, because if they leave the game and it checks the time now, it might be a week later. And so the item should already be wilted, but it's just now going to be adding it to the time now. So instead of set to, for one thing, we're going to add. And we're going to add it. We're just going to add the value we want to the time in there. Because the time that's in there was the time it should have been done. So now we can add 10 more seconds to that if we want it to wilt 10 seconds after it should have been done. We can just add 10,000 more milliseconds to that. And then we can change the animation to wilted. So, first let me do that, and then we'll run through the second thing I want to show you. So what we'll do is, okay, let's do another one real quick. We're going to change the animation to wilted. Copy that and paste it here. And right away, we're going to run into some problems with this one. So as you can see, it immediately changes it to wilted. Let me move that around and try this. And this time it didn't change it to wilted. So let's just understand the ordering here. What it's doing is, the first way we had it, we're just asking it to check if stats time is greater or less than timestamp. And so here we have our original stats time, and then here we add 10 seconds to it, or 10,000 milliseconds to it. And so what it's doing is it's coming down here saying, oh, as soon as time is less than our timestamp, our current time, we'll change the animation, and then we'll change it again. So we need to tell it some way to distinguish that from each other, so it knows which one we're talking about. Because both of these, we need to change it to harvest and to wilted, depending on if the stats time is less than the current time now. So one way we can do this is to get we can compare animations. So let's just say land current animation is equal to, and then we'll type in the seedling state. So it'll be stats stage. Oh, we need variable first. Land variable stats stage seedling. Okay, so if it's stats stage seedling and the time is time for it to change, it'll change to harvest. So let's copy that, and we'll say if it's harvest, then it'll change to wilted. And we're probably going to see another problem. In this problem, go ahead and plant our items. And we'll wait our 10 seconds. Well, actually, this is perfect. Which means I did something wrong, because it shouldn't have. Okay, and see, here's what I did wrong. We're saying if it's on wilted, set it to wilted. Well, it can never be wilted. So we need to say if it's harvest, set it to wilted. So let me go ahead and close this preview real quick. And we'll say if it's harvest, set it to wilted. So now it immediately again turns to wilted. So let's move the wilted one up first, and then we'll see why it's doing that. So the problem is the order of events, which actually that's not the problem. That's what a lot of people think the problem is. They think it's the order of events. See, we changed the order of events, and now it's working fine. So we think, well, that's a good solution. Because now it'll change to harvest first, and then after 10,000 milliseconds, it's going to change to the wilted animation, okay? And why that is because in this first instance, GDevelop reads everything from top to bottom. It'll get down to the bottom, and it'll come back up. It'll skip these beginning with scene events, of course, because it already did those once. But it'll read everything else down top to bottom. So what it was doing in the first place, it was looking at our value that we stored in our time variable, and it was seeing that it was less than timestamp. And it was coming here and seeing that the stage of animation was seedling. And so it was changing that to harvest. But before it did anything else, it realized that the animation was now harvest, and this condition was still true. Time was still less than this current time, okay? It's not even looking at this right now, where it should have changed it and added more time to it. Because as soon as it changed that to harvest, even if we change the order, as soon as it changes that to harvest, let's change the order and see. Once again, even though we put change the time first and then set it to harvest, it's still seeing this as harvest and this as harvest, so it must change it to wilted, because this original condition of our time being less than, so us adding the time is not fixing it. So changing the order does fix it if we put the wilted one up first, because then when it's going to check for, it's going to check to see, is our variable time less than timestamp and the animation on harvest? No. Oh, well, let's go to the next one. Is our animation on seedling? Yes. Okay, let's set the animation to harvest. And then it's going to continue going down our script. It's going to come right back to the top, and it's going to check again and say, oh, well, now it's on harvest, but the time variable is not less than the current time. So we'll just continue down until the time variable is actually to the wilted, okay? So it's easy to fall into a temptation to think that the problem is your order of events, and the way to fix it is to reorder your events. And that is a viable way to do it if you really can't think of anything else, or if that's the simpler of the solution. But it actually could cause more complexity later in your events. So what we're going to do is we're going to see the root of the real problem. And the real problem is we are referencing animations against animations, and then based on animations, we are trying to change the animations. That's the real problem. We're creating a weird loop because we're only referencing animations against other animations. We're referencing a thing against the same thing. So that's the real problem. Okay? So if we were referencing animations to something else, like a variable, and changing animations based on a variable, then we wouldn't be creating a weird loop. We would be creating like a braid, because we would create a variable here, and based on that variable, we would change the animation here, and based on that animation, we would change the variable here, and based on that variable, we would change the animation here. So we're making more of a braid and less of a loop, a weird loop where we just reference animations against animations, or variables against variables. So let's fix the real problem before we get any further into our logic. Because even though we can see we can fix the problem just by changing the order, like I said, that causes more complexities later on in your code. It's easier just to solve the problem, the real problem, by not referencing things against themselves. So what we're going to do now, we're going to get rid of this changing the animation. We're not going to change the animation at all in this event. We're going to change a variable. So let's hit land, and we'll create a variable. And we're going to create a text variable this time, because we're going to put different words in there to show what different state the land is in. So we can store this variable anywhere, but I'm going to store it inside our stats variable, because this variable will be something that we reasonably need to save. So all of our save events I want to keep in our stats variable, so that later in the tutorial when we make our save system, everything's very convenient in one variable for us. So we'll call this variable stats.cycle, and that'll stand for what cycle our land is in. And we'll set it to, let's see, this is the first stage where we're going to be planting the seedling animation. So we're going to call this variable seedling, so it'll match. And you don't have to name your variables like this. I'm doing it for the tutorial because it'll be easier for you to follow along. There might be reasons for you wanting really short variables, so in your own projects you have to look at that. So now let's set up our braid. We're going to go ahead and add a new event, highlight it, and Shift W to get our event group. And we're going to call this one Land Animation. Okay, so our very first animation, we want to set our land animation to our seedling variable. So let's say if the value of the land variable, see variable text of an object variable stats.cycle, if that value is equal to seedling, then we want to change our animation of our land to seedling. So let's just copy one of these and paste it here. And then instead of wilted, we're going to say seedling. Okay. So that's our first rule. If our stat cycle seedling, so if we drag our icon across the land and we set our variable cycle to seedling, then it'll see that our cycle is on seedling, and then it will change our animation. So see, we're making the braid. Change the variable, use the variable to change the animation. Use the animation to change the variable. Use the variable to change the animation. Use the animation to change the variable. Okay, so that's a braid, and that's going to give us a lot less problems later on. So if we want to change it to seedling here, to set it on the seedling animation, let's also take this out here. Let's make a new event where we can store those so we can just drag them around later. And let's toggle that one disabled real quick. Okay, so we're going to paste this in, and we're going to change the text variable stat cycle of land to harvest, because our animation is on seedling. So from seedling, if it's on seedling and it's time to change to the next animation, it'll be time for it to go to our harvest animation. Okay, so now we can see what we're going to do here. We're going to change the variable to harvest, and we're going to add 10,000 milliseconds to our time, which is 10 more seconds. And that way, after that, it's going to set our animation to wilted. So now, when it adds 10,000 milliseconds, it'll look and see our timestamp. We need to come down here, and we need to say the same thing as this. The text variable cycle is seedling. We're going to change that to harvest. We need a new event for that. So okay, then we're going to use our animation. We're going to pull it up here, change our animation to harvest. So far, so easy. Let's make a third event now, because we know if these two events, harvest, seedling, we know the next one's going to be wilted. So let's paste that here. If our variable cycle is wilted, we will change our animation to wilted. Okay, so wilted, change the number of the animation of land to wilted. Very good. Let me delete that one. Okay, so now into the it's going to check the time and see if our stage is harvest, and if it is, we can change the stat cycle variable to wilted. And so now we have our nice braid going. And now it doesn't matter what order. We don't have to have this wilted first, because we're not just referencing something against itself and trying to change the value of that something against the value it already is. We're creating a nice braid. We're changing the variable to seedling, using that variable to change the animation, using that animation to change the variable, using that variable to change the animation, using that. I mean, I know I'm trying to drill this in, I'm sorry, but it's just something, if you understand that, it's gonna really be helpful to you in your logic. So let's go ahead and preview this. And now, even though it's not in the correct order, well, it is in the correct order of the way it should happen, but it's not in the reverse order that is often recommended that you do things in GDevelop in reverse order, because there is this mistaken idea that because GDevelop reads things from top to bottom, that you need to order things from bottom to top. When really, as I've said, the real problem is you're referencing things against the same thing, and that's creating the weird loop. Okay? So as you can see, it's working fine now. Okay, so now that we've gotten that part drilled into your head, and hopefully my head too, because I'm still learning and improving every day, I hope. So what we're going to do now is we are going to work on the time we want our object to wilt. And typically in these type of games, if you have an item that took an hour to make, then 2 hours after it is finished, it will be ruined. That's typically how it goes. So what we can do here, instead of just adding a flat amount, is we can come in here and we can change, once it's ripe, we can change the value of stats time, which remember is already set to the time that it was ripened. It's already set to that in our previous event where we planted it. We can add to that the value that we want, how long it to take before it wilts. So since these type of games typically make that value twice the length that it took to grow it or to make it. So if it took, and you remember our variable that we store the length that it took to make it is called growth length. So let's change this to land variable stats growth length times 2. So now if it took 10 seconds to make it, once that 10 seconds is up, it's going to add an additional 20 seconds to that before it wilts, okay? And I will say, one thing about these games I have noticed, if you're making this type of game, is that if the object did not take that long to make, say it took half an hour, or say it took 15 minutes or 2 minutes, they don't typically say, well, if it took half an hour to make, you only get an hour to collect it, or you only get 30 minutes to collect it if it took 15 minutes to make. So they usually exempt the quicker making products from the twice length rule before it ruins. So if you want to do that, I'm just going to mention this. Go into your variables, and in your quicker growing items, add another child to your stats. And you will not have to add this to all your items. If an item takes 10 hours, you don't need to add this. But if your item is really quick, say it takes 2 minutes to make, but you want it to be good for 2 hours, then you would write wilt length or something like that. And just meaning that's how long you want it to wilt. And you're going to set that to a number also. And then you can give it a value. Say you want it to be good for 2 hours. Put 2 hours in seconds and then add 3 zeros to it, okay? And so now, instead of using this, I gave you the land variable stats growth length times 2. We're still going to use that. The land variable stats growth length times 2. You would add to that, you would add to that plus your land variable stats wilt length. And you would just have your logic set up like that. Because doing that, it wouldn't affect anything that didn't have the wilt length variable in it, because it would just assume that that was 0. So it would just still be doing it by the land variable stats growth length times 2 plus 0. So it would only affect the shorter growing things that you actually had that variable set up in. So that's just one thing you could look at doing if for that situation. Okay. Completely messed that up. Alright, so now that we have that done, I'm just going to come back up here to our event where we're changing the text variable and we're putting that JSON object and then converting that JSON to a structure. Since you notice we are adding more children to that as we go on, that it didn't start out. We now have stats time and stats cycle. So when you do that, it's just very important to keep it in this order, to store the text in there and then to convert it immediately into your structure. Because say if you had something in between it, it would store the text in here and then it would overwrite it with the value of this variable. And then when it went to parse it, it wouldn't have anything to parse because you just overwrote that. So if you're storing it into the same variable that you're going to put it into, like I am, that's just something to be aware of. Now, we could very well have changed a scene variable and stored that text JSON into it and then converted it and sent that to our land instead of just storing it into stats and then converting it and putting it right back into stats. That would help too. But so that's just one more thing to be aware of. So the next thing we're going to look at is cleaning up our code just a little bit. And if you notice here, we're saying if the text of our variable cycle is equal to seedling, we're going to change the animation of land and we're going to set it to seedling. So this code is actually going to do that several times a second. It's going to keep coming down here and seeing, okay, its cycle is called seedling, so I'm going to change the animation to seedling. Even if our animation is already on seedling and it doesn't need to do that. So we need to find some way to trigger it once. So let's try the condition trigger once while true. And let's just see what that happens. So we're going to, that's what happened. It did it exactly one time because I said trigger it once. And so it's not going to do it again. And this is one of the things you have to be aware of is that trigger once isn't always an ideal solution for things you only want to happen once. But the good news is it's not the only solution. I actually have a game when I'm creating my projects to see how far I can get in the project without ever having to use a trigger once. And that way my mind is constantly open to the possibilities of how to get things to have a trigger once behavior without actually using trigger once. And the reason it's good to do that is for situations like this where you can't use a trigger once, but because we're already playing that game of never having to use a trigger once, which sometimes you do, don't get me wrong. But since we're aware of the possibility that we don't always have to use a trigger once, something like this is easy for us to fix. So all we're really wanting to do is if the text variable stat cycle is seedling and our animation is already on seedling, we don't want to keep changing it to seedling because that just wastes resources of the system that you're using to run your game. If it keeps having to needlessly change something that's already on the animation you want. So instead of using a trigger once, we're going to just flat out say what we want. We want it to first check to see what its animation is. So we'll say land, current animation is not equal to, and then the value to compare, of course, is land variable stats stage seedling. So now what this logic is going to do, it's going to say if my cycle is seedling, and we'll invert, we don't need to invert it because I put it to not equal to. If this is on seedling, if the variable is on seedling, but I didn't set the animation to seedling already to change the animation. So now if the animation is already set to that, it's not going to set it to that. So let's just go ahead and copy that and we'll paste it here. Same thing, we'll check, was it already on harvest? And we'll go ahead and copy that. And we'll paste it here. And we'll see if it was already on wilted. Okay, so we have that part of code cleaned up a little. Okay, so now that we have our crops growing correctly, we're almost finished with our setup logic for this project. The next thing we need to look at is how to harvest those crops. So I'm just going to hit Shift W again to get a new event group, and I'll call this event group Harvesting Crops. Alright, so we can look at harvesting crops very similar as to planting them. We have a blade, and we want to tell the blade that when the blade is touching the land, that it's time to change the animation of the land back to the default state. Okay? Because obviously there shouldn't be any more crops on the land. So let's go see what we could do. Well, first we can set up a point on the blade so that only that point, similar to the points we had here. So let's go ahead and select our blade item and we'll edit our points. We're going to add a point and just add it wherever it makes sense to you that the player would be harvesting a crop when that point of the blade touched the land. So let me clean up these values here. And I'm going to call this point reap. Okay. So close that up. So now that I have my point set up, we can use very similar logic to this. In fact, I'm just going to select this whole thing and copy that, and we'll come down here and we'll paste it to my condition. And instead of crop icons though, we'll say if our blade point X, and we'll name the blade reap. And our blade point Y, so blade, and that one is also named reap, is inside of our land. Okay, so what do we want to do? Well, there's two things we want to do. So one would be change the animation, and two would be play some sort of animation that signifies that we just harvested crops. So let's go ahead and add a new event, and we'll say if our cycle of land is on harvest. Okay, so our land variable, text of an object variable, stats.cycle is equal to harvest, which means they're ripe. Then we are going to want to we're going to have to create an object. So let's go add some objects to create first. Okay, so we'll make a new sprite and we'll call this one, what have I not used yet? We'll go ahead and just call it berry crop. Okay, and we'll add our animation. And I'm just going to add the same animation we used in our menu. Okay, and we'll go ahead and hit apply. And we'll add a new object. This will be our wheat crop. A new sprite. And wheat crop. And we'll go ahead and add our animation wheat. And now actually, I'm thinking we might want a tween behavior, because that's how I set up my project when I was making it for this tutorial. I used a tween, so we'll go ahead and keep a tween behavior on that. And we're going to go ahead and create a group for these objects so we can reference them as one item instead of having to reference them individually. So we'll call this group crops. And we'll go ahead and add those two objects to our group. Our berry crop and our wheat crop. Okay, so the next thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create an object. So create an object. And here we run into a problem. If we just say create an object crops, it's just going to pick a random one. And we do have this right here where we can create an object from its name. But we need to store the name of that object into our land so it can see which one to create. So let's go ahead and do that. Which means we have to go back to our berry icon and back to our variable stats. And we're going to go ahead and add another child to that. And this child, we'll call it crop name. And we'll keep it as a string. And the name of the object that we wanted to, the berry crop to create is called berry crop. Okay, so we have that set up. Now let's go to our wheat variables, add a child to the stats, and name it the same thing, crop name. And we'll use the exact name we named that object with, and that was wheat crop. So now we have a way, because this is the variable that we pass into land, we have a way of calling up the object that we want our land to create when it's finished, okay? So if the blade is inside the land and the land variable is harvest, then we're going to go ahead and create an object from its name. Now it says enter the group of potential objects. We stored those objects in our crops group, so we'll hit that. Now it says the name of the object to create, and we stored that in our icon variable that gets passed to our land variable with the same name. So let's hit land variable, and we want the variable string because it's not numbers, and we called that stats crop name. So it's going to look at what words we stored there, and it's going to create that same named object. And we'll create it at the X position. We'll say land X. And we'll create it at the Y position, land Y. Okay, and on the layer, now this is where it could get tricky. We'll leave it like this for now. We'll create it on the base layer. And later, after we see how it runs, we'll probably change that to a new layer. So let's see. The first thing we want to do, we want to create an object. So let's go see if that's working. Let's go ahead and plant our quick growing wheat. Did I not add wheat? Oh, did I not add them to the UI layer? Okay, that's better. Now, we'll plant our wheat and our strawberry, and we'll see if we're getting anything or if we have to tweak our logic. Okay, we see it is creating something. You can barely see it. So we're going to change the X a little, I think. And we're just going to change the X. We'll say 50 above our land X. So our create event, we'll say we'll create it at land X plus 50. And we'll watch it grow. Watching wheat grow. Okay, you can still see it's creating something. It's not very impressive right now. So we're also going to have to set the land animation to 0. But before we do that, let me just test something because I don't believe it's actually even creating one for every spot. So I just want to see something. And the strawberries are a bit shorter. Okay, it's not. It's picking and choosing which land it creates that item for. And part of that could be because I'm moving the blade super fast, so it's hitting maybe more than one at once. Let's set them on another layer though so I can see that for real. Let's add a layer, and we're going to call this layer Harvest. And we'll just move it below the UI layer, but above the base layer. And so now let's go see if we change this to layer Harvest. Let's see if it shows up better. Because right now it's getting Y sorted underneath the Okay. So it does seem to be creating it for everyone. No, it missed one. There it goes. I might need to change that though, and I'm thinking we'll see in a minute. So the next thing we need to do is set our animation of our land to 0. So land, change the animation, set to 0. Okay, so when we do this, we're going to see right off the bat that it does not work the way we intended. Okay, so why is that? It is setting it to 0, if you notice. But what's happening, and it's actually a good thing. It's actually super good for our save events later. What's happening is that it still has the stats variable stored in it. So as soon as we are not in collision with that land anymore, it looks at our stats variable and it runs the logic and it sees, oh, the time is greater than this. I've got to set the animation to harvest again. Okay? And so that's actually super good because that means when we save our game, when we pull it up again, just our logic that we've written right now will reinstate the land exactly the way it should be. So that's super good. But what we're going to need to do in this event is get rid of that variable. Because with that variable there, it's going to keep changing our animation back even though we want it set to 0. So let me just do that real quick. We'll just set the variable to 0. So land variable. And you can clear it. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to completely override it. And there's a reason why I would rather override it than clear it. So let's go ahead and we'll hit the value of an object variable, and we're going to hit stats. Because when we overwrite stats, it's going to overwrite everything in it. So we'll set that to 0. So now we've gone from having a structured variable, which is telling GDevelop what animation we want our land to have and what time to, change the animations. We're clearing that completely out and we're setting it to 0. So let's move that above our change the animation, and now let's see what happens. Okay, so now what happens is what we want to happen. Once our stats variable is gone, GDevelop no longer is rereading it and resetting it up. Okay, so, and actually, I know why that number went up. I set the wrong one. I put it to X and it should have been Y if I wanted it higher. So I'm going to change that to, I guess minus 50Y is going up. Let me see what that does. Okay, that's a little bit higher. I might keep it like that. We'll see. So the next thing we're going to want to do is I'm just going to change the scale of our crops. Right here, scale, just to make it slightly smaller than the menu icons. So we'll set that to 0.75. All right. So now we're going to do the same thing for our wilted animation. So let's go ahead and add some new events. Okay. So in our wilted animation, we are going to copy this here. And if our cycle is on, if our cycle variable says wilted, then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to change the variable stats of land set to 0, because otherwise, remember, it's just going to keep setting it back to wilted. And then we're going to change the animation of land and we're going to set that to 0. And the only thing different that we're going to do there, we're not going to create the object crops. Okay? So now we have our crops harvested a little. And we can work on tweening the crops. Okay, so let's add a new event group. So we'll go ahead and call this event group Tween for Harvest. And let me just indent one of these. And on this event group, we want to see if any of these crop items that come up are on the scene. We want to make them fall down and bounce a little bit. So let's see. So if we have any of these little things on the scene, we want to make them fall down and bounce, just for a little decorative touch to our project. So let's go ahead and say, let's see, we'll hit crops and we'll put instances. And this time, instead of instances picked, we'll say number of instances on the scene. And we'll put is greater than 0. So if there's any instances on the scene, it's going to do this. And what we'll do is we'll create a tween for that crop. And let's see, crops. And here we go. Tween object position. And we just want to tween the Y position. Okay, and we'll call this tween bounce. And we're going to tween it to, let's see. Let's say we'll tween it to our land Y. Well, let's do our crops Y because, no, let's do our land Y because it's down below. So we'll do land Y plus 50. And we'll go ahead and give it an easing. Let's see. They've got a huge list here. So let's do, let's see if they have a bounce. Okay, ease out bounce. And we'll do it over 1 second. So I'm just going to see what that looks like real quick, because I don't really remember how I did it in the project I made for this tutorial. Okay. So what we're doing here, we could trigger it once, but remember, I don't really trigger things once. I'm not even sure if you can trigger a tween once. I tell you, I rarely use it in my projects. I prefer to do things that don't require a trigger once, but we'll try it. We'll see what happens. Okay, so that didn't, I mean, it worked. One of them fell and bounced. But here's where thinking outside the trigger one box comes in handy, because you can make things only do it one time without using that trigger once. So we do it as bounce. All right. So we're just going to add the condition that if it's not already playing bounce, then it will make it bounce. So that way it's not trying to make it. See, what it's doing now is every time it reads the code, it's trying to just now start that tween. So we need to tell it not to start that tween if the tween is already playing. So let's look for tween, and we'll look for tween is playing, okay? And we'll say the tween on crops that we called bounce, and we'll invert this condition. So now we're saying only if this tween is not already playing will we play this tween. So that way it's not like restarting that tween every fraction of a second. So let's test this out. But I am glad I tried that trigger once, because it's a good learning thing. All right, now. Okay, so that's a little more what I like right there. Although, if you notice, it's picking out certain, I guess because we're doing it to the land, it's picking out certain land. So let's just do it to the crop themselves. That way they'll stay at their own position. And we'll go ahead and try it like that. Also, I'm not sure I like the height of it after all, but... Okay, so that's a little more... Oh. No, we gotta fix this now. Let me close out of here. So let's go ahead and make a new condition that will get rid of our crop objects once the tween is done. And we actually have one here. We could just hit destroy it when it's done. But I'm not going to use that because I want to, I also want to use that logic to add our crops to our inventory. So we'll just check if our crops tween, let's see, finished playing. Our tween identifier was bounce. So if our tween bounce on crops has finished playing, we are going to delete our crops. So delete the object crops. Okay, and another thing we're going to want to do is, well, let's get that started first, and then we'll do our inventory action. I'm just going to see if that solves the little problem. Okay, and it does. Now when our crops fall, they delete themselves. I'm probably going to change this value though. We'll just do crops y plus 50, but we'll come over here where we added 50 to the height, and we'll just take that away. So that way they're not so high up, and they'll look like they fall a little farther down. So now we're going to work on our inventory. So we're actually going to have to create our first scene variable for this. And how we're going to do this is, since we're not going to know what crops are done playing and what crops to tell it to add to our inventory, we're going to have to use a variable. So let's create a scene variable that we can use. So we'll just type in variable. and it'll be a number variable. So we'll go ahead and say value of a scene variable. Let me find it here. And that variable, we're going to call that variable stats. But we want this variable to have a child in it that has to do with our crops. So we're going to call this child crops. And this child is going to be a structure itself. So we have a structure called stats. We're making one now as a scene variable. And in this scene variable, we want a structure called crops. And in this structure called crops, we want a name of every different crop that we harvest. So to do that, let's use some square brackets. And we got our square brackets set up here. Okay, so in this square brackets, I'm going to call the name of my crops variable name. So I'm going to probably have to create a variable first. Let me just go ahead and OK this, just so we have it in our scene. And let's go back to our crop icons. And we're going to have to give them a variable that we can use to pass to our scene variable. So we'll call this variable name. And it'll be a string. And we'll just give it whatever name we want our inventory to have. So I'm going to call this berry. And I'll hit apply, and I'll do the same in my wheat crop. We'll just create a variable, and we'll call this variable name, and the name of this one will be wheat. Okay, so now we have something that we can pass to the scene variable that we're creating. So we're creating a variable called stats.crops. Now our square bracket, we're just going to go ahead and write the name of our crops. And our crops, what was our variable? We just called it, let's see, it was variable. It'll be a variable string because it was letters. So variable string. And then I believe we named it name. So you want that in parentheses, inventory. Okay, and we'll change the color to white. And I'm going to change the size to 40. And I'm just going to leave that text alone. And I'm going to drag 2 of these out onto our scene, just so we can see what's happening here. Okay, let's see, we'll put them both at 100. And, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Okay, I meant the Y. We'll put them both at 25. Okay, so, I'm going to move this one over though. So now let's make an event. Let's see, we'll go ahead and create a new event. And we're going to call this event inventory updates. Well, let's say inventory and text updates. So we're going to need to update our inventory boxes, our text boxes, with the number they're holding, okay? And to do that, we're going to know which one represents which one. So let's click this, and we'll come to our side panel over here. And where it says instant variables, don't try to create one right here, because it's really annoying. Create one like this, and we'll just add a variable, and we'll call this variable crop name. And so it'll be a string, and this one I'm going to call it berry. And I'm going to go ahead and apply that. I'm going to hit our next inventory, and once again we're going to create an instant variable. We'll hit this one right here, and we'll make a variable called crop name, and we're going to set that one to wheat. So now we're already telling the scene variable to store the number of crops that we harvest. Let's even see if that's working before we get too far on our logic. And then if it is, we'll go ahead and pass that number to our text boxes here. Okay, let's run our debugger. And we'll look at our scene variables right here. Okay, and so we harvested wheat, and we see that when we harvest it and that tween was finished playing, it did create a structured variable with another structured variable inside it called crops. And it assigned the name of our crop as we told it to. And it gave it the value of 8 because we harvested 8 wheat. So we know that part's working. So now, and that's how we did it. We made stats, crops, and then we passed in the little variable name that we put in our little crop icons right here. We said wheat and we said berry. So now we can use that information to pass it to our text boxes so they'll display the correct number of items that we have. So for our text boxes, let's create a variable for them, and we're going to call this variable crop quantity. And we already have a variable that we gave them, that we needed to give them, and that was their individual instance variable of their crop name that they represent. So we needed to put that value in, but we don't need to put the quantity in because the quantity is something that's going to be changing during gameplay. So let's say let's change the variable of inventory. So inventory variable, and it's going to be the value of an object variable because it's a number. And the variable we're creating right now, we'll call it crop quantity. And we're going to set that to a formula. And the formula we want to use is the scene variable that has the same name as the instance variable we gave the text box. So for scene variable, we just type in variable and we see this scene variable right here. So the scene variable, and now to get the child of that scene variable we need, we'll reference the variable's name was stats, the child's name was crops, and then the child we want, we've got to put that in a variable because we don't know what child we want. We're not there harvesting crops with the player, so we can't tell GDevelop, put the wheat in now. So we got to put a variable there. So to do that, once again, we're going to get our square brackets, and we're going to say inventory, and that's the name of our text box, inventory, and then variable string, because we want the name so we can tell the scene variable of all its children that it has in crops. This is the name of the child we want to get that number of, okay? So variable string, and then the variable string we gave to our inventory, we called it crop name. Okay. Oh, and I gotta add wait a minute, y'all. We also gotta add the last brackets, and they're gonna go right there. Okay. So now what's gonna happen, we're creating a new variable called crop quantity. And we're telling our inventory text box to put that value as the scene variable that shares the name that we gave it right here in our instance variable. So if it's berry, it's going to put berry in. And if it's wheat, it's going to put wheat in. Okay? So now that we're accessing that, we're also going to need to limit when it does that, because it really only needs this. Again, it's like the trigger once. It really only needs to do this if this value changes. Like a lot of the times you're growing crops, that value isn't changing. because you're in the middle of growing crops. So you're not needing to update this, but it will, because there's no condition here telling it not to. So let's say if our crop quantity variable of our inventory item is not the same as the same name of that scene variable, then we'll update it, okay? So let's just add that condition. So crop, oh no, it was our text box. Inventory variable crop quantity is not equal to our scene variable, and that was stats crops, and then we don't know which one it's talking about, so we have to put in that variable. And remember, to do that, we're going to use the square brackets. So our inventory text box variable string, and the name of that string was crop name. Okay, and now we'll put our closing brackets right in between those two parentheses. So now what it's going to do, on our inventory text box, it's going to look at its crop quantity, which is going to start out as 0, of course, when we create it. And it's going to look at the scene variable. And if it's not the same, it's going to change our crop quantity to that variable. Now that's all it's going to do so far. We haven't set it up to change the text yet. We'll just show you real quick what we did set it up to do. Let's go ahead and let's get some of both here. So when we harvest this, it's going to pass the number that we're harvesting to our scene variable. And from there, it's going to pass that number to our text box variable, not the text box itself. I haven't set it up for that yet. So let's just make some numbers here. And now let's go ahead and run the debugger. And we'll go ahead and fresh, and we'll check our scene variable. And you notice now it says our berry, we have 4. It created all this just from our events. It says berry, we have 4, wheat, we have 6. So now let's go find our inventory items. And we have 2 text box. And so sure enough, on our crop name that we set to berry in the instance variable, in our little editor in the scene here, it looked and it saw that it shared that name with our scene variable. So it updated the crop quantity of that text box to 4. And so the other one, it looked and it saw it had the same name as our scene variable here, wheat. And so it updated the value of its quantity to 6. So now we can work on, we're just going to quickly tell our text box, and close this preview. We're just going to quickly tell our text box that now we want to also display it. And so we could keep it right here and just have it as a separate event. Let's go ahead and change the text. We're going to hit inventory, modify the text, and we're going to set it to, let's set it to the value of the name we gave it so that we know what is what. So we'll set it to inventory variable string crop name, okay? And then we're going to add a plus. And then, well, I'm not going to format it yet, so you can see what it looks like without that. Then we're going to add our number of quantity in that text box. So we'll put plus inventory. We'll put our text box there. Variable. And this time it's not a variable string because we're going to be doing a number. So we'll just say variable. And it's going to say toString variable because that's what it says to numbers when it's about to put them in a text box. So, and that variable we called crop quantity. So now when we run it, what it should do is it should update the text once we harvest something. Well, actually, see, it updated it already. Because what happens is when I'm asking it to change the text of inventory and set it to this variable string plus this, Since the crop quantity isn't created yet, it's just looking for it, created it, and it gave it a value of 0 since it didn't exist. So now let's go ahead and update some values. And so we see when the tween is done playing, it updates the values of our text. Now let's just add a formatting line. So what we had is fine. We're just going to add one more thing. So after this first plus, we're going to use double quotes, and then we're going to use a colon, then we're going to hit a space, and then we're going to use double quotes, and then we're going to use a space, and we're going to hit plus and another space. And so now all that's going to do is format it for us a little nicer so that our little text is like that. So far so good. Now, since this doesn't have a condition, it's changing this like constantly, even when it's just sitting there and the quantity is the same. So what we're going to do is pull it under here. And that way, once again, it's only updating it if these things are changed. Because remember, we're only doing this if this changes. And so now, only if these two things happen, will it do this thing. So we're good on that. Okay, so now we're just going to run through a test run. Because there was something I noticed in the example that I had created for this tutorial. And I'm just going to say maybe I did something different so it doesn't apply here. But it seemed to me on that one, there was 2 instances where it would not update the project numbers correctly, okay? So one of them was if I seem to go too fast. See, that should have been 16. And that was only 13. And what I believed was happening in the project example I made for this tutorial was actually 2 things. And one of the things that fixed it was instead of changing when the tween bounce on crops has finished playing, instead of adding 1, which would be the logical thing to do, but what seemed to be happening is if I did it really fast and 2 tweens actually finished at the same time, it would just count that as 1. Because, and that makes sense, and it's mine. They're both going at the same time. They both end at the same time, and I only told it to add that 1. So one thing that fixed that was instead of adding 1, we're going to add the picked instances count. So that means the number of ones that just finished playing that tween. And of course the item is crops, because it's our crops that will be done playing that tween. So that was one thing that seemed to keep the inventory adding correctly. Okay, so we'll just test it out again. But there was one other thing that I'm not really sure applied. I might have done something differently this time. Okay. So I'm not getting that result, so I probably did do something different. Let me try one more time, because I might change it anyway, just in case it needs to be. Let me see. Yeah, I think actually I must have done something different to where that's not happening now. Because I do remember in the project I made for this tutorial, that up here where we had this blade point inside of the land, I distinctly remember I had to use a repeat for each instance. So let's just go ahead and hit Shift W, and I'm going to put for each object, and we're going to put land. Okay. And I remember having to do that because it was something about if my blade hit it just right and it hit 2 pieces of land at once, it would only create 1 crop that came down. And I'm not doing it in this one, so possibly because I changed the point of my blade, but I am just going to re-add that because if you're having that issue, that would be the next thing to change. So Those are the two things that now make it identical to my project. So probably I just had the point on the blade in a different part to where maybe it was more easily hitting two pieces of land at once, and now it's not. So that might have just fixed it, but I'm still going to put that there just so that it never happens that I only hit two pieces of land at once and only get one crop back. Let me see if I can get it. Come on, strawberries, don't fail me. Okay. Oh, well, I mean, I guess it would because I already put that there, so it wouldn't matter if I hit it twice now. I mean, one with, hit two at once, in other words. So the next thing we're going to do, as you can see, when we start up the preview, the text is really ugly, so we're just going to make a new beginning of scene event to fix that text. Okay, so let's add a new event. Shift A is going to bring up a little box there. And we're going to just change the variable. We're going to say change the variable. Oh, wait. Let's hit our inventory. Inventory variable. Crop quantity. And we're going to change that. And we're going to set it to our variable. Let's see. What was that? Stats. It was scene variable, stats, crops, and then it was our inventory variable crop name. So let's write our square brackets and we'll say inventory text box variable crop name. And what this is going to do, and then we got to add our square brackets right in between the parentheses, our ending square bracket. And what this is going to do is the reason why it's not showing up is because we actually haven't created, we haven't run into the logic yet that needs it. So right now, since we have no quantity in our scene variable, it's like it doesn't even exist until we start harvesting stuff. And then once we harvest stuff, it'll create the scene variable. And actually I did create it just now by calling it up here. So, but before I called it up here, it literally, let's toggle this out real quick. Toggle disabled, we're going to preview the scene and we're going to view the debugger. Okay, so you can see what I mean. So in the beginning, our scene variable, well, I must call it somewhere. But anyway, it's just not set up in the beginning of the scene to start showing our text, really, until we start harvesting stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the crop quantity of inventory and we're going to set it to that. And now, because it's at 0 and our crop quantity is at 0, it's not updating the text. Because we told it down here not to update the text if it's the same, to only update the text if they're different. And that's perfectly fine to do, except in the beginning of the scene if they're both at 0. Because we want it to say, we don't want it to say text. We want it to say wheat 0, berry 0. So now we're going to change the text of inventory. We're going to modify the text and we're going to set it to, and we can do the same thing here. Let's just okay that to get that set up there. And then we'll come down here and we'll copy what we have. We'll hit Control A to select it all and Control C to copy it. And then we'll go right back up here and we'll just hit Control V to paste it in. Oop. Okay, so now when we open the game, it should just show wheat 0 and berry 0. Because even if it's matching, which it would only be matching when the player first started the game. Or if the player's inventory, if they'd used all and it was at 0. But now we don't have to worry if it's at 0 because now in the beginning scene events, we've taken care of that to sort of beautify the project. Okay, so now really quick, I'm just going to come in here and do one more beautification. Just in case, we're also going to add the Y-sort behavior to our little crops here. And let me just double check the events to make sure everything looks all right. Okay, so everything looks pretty good. I'm going to go over it again outside the video with a fine-tooth comb to make sure it's a good example before I upload this to the itch.io. But I will be uploading this file in case you want to follow along with my next video where we create save events for this game, but don't want to actually create the project itself. So I'll have two separate files on my itch.io page. One will be just the assets in case you want to follow along with creating the game logic yourself, and the other file will be the completed example project in case you want to work on save events but you aren't necessarily interested in working on time. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. In my next tutorial, I'll go ahead and add save events to this example project, and then if anyone's interested, I can do a bonus video on adding fertilizer logic to this project so that you get 2 crops every time you harvest. And I'll probably actually do a tutorial on that even if no one is initially interested, because I do notice a lot of times when I do things, other people don't get interested until years later. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's given you some idea of how you can create or use time in your own game. And hopefully you'll be around for the next one too, where you can get some different ideas on how to create a save system. And these are just not necessarily the best way to do things, but I do think the more, as a developer, the more you see how 10 different people handle the same problem in 10 different ways, it really gives you a well-rounded look, and it gives you a very big tool bag to use from when you're designing your own thing. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this and have fun creating your games. Nope, I just happened to glance up and look at what we have here. A possible trigger once event, but remember I have a game where I don't use trigger once a lot. So what that's doing is it's setting the behavior constantly. So instead of doing that, we're going to check if the behavior is already going or not. Let me see. So if the behavior of draggable is not activated, and we're going to have to split this down because we don't want to change the position of menu items only if the behavior is not activated. So let's go ahead and add a new event. Pull that down. So now what it's going to do is it's always going to change the position back to the original position when we drop the menu icons. But it's only going, because that's a oh, actually, you know what? I don't need that in this one, because menu items was just dropped. That is a trigger once. I've tested that before. I tested it by also having it add a value to a variable and seeing if it only added once or if it added like 6 million. And every single time it only added once. So we don't need to change that there. This is like a trigger once. So now being dragged, let's see. And that's fine too, because if we're being dragged and it's more than one, it's going to deactivate the behavior. And once it's deactivated, they're no longer being dragged. So it's not going to continuously do that. So I thought I found a flaw in my logic, but I was actually mistaken for once. Anyway, now good night for real.